Before we start, a quick note about what this channel is and what it isn't. This isn't a recap channel, and it's not a highlight reel. We're here for the parts of Panem that happen after the cameras turn away, the systems behind the games, the contracts hidden inside victory, the lives that keep unfolding long after the anthem ends. Each video on this channel is built to slow things down, to follow the logic the capital relies on, the details it hopes you won't connect, and the people who live with the consequences year after year. If that's the kind of Hunger Games analysis you're looking for, you're in the right place. Subscribing just means you'll keep a seat here when we move on to the next story. Now, let's start where Panem always wants you to stop paying attention. The cornucopia horn is designed to be seen, shiny, symmetrical, perfectly framed by capital cameras. But here's the real question. What does that lens refuse to show you once it cuts away? When the feed jumps to a sponsor gift or a commentator's face? What's still happening in the shadow of that silver curve? Just out of frame. At face value, the Hunger Games are already brutal. You see the bloodbath, the cannons, the highlight reel of deaths that the capital packages as entertainment. But the most disturbing moments in Panem aren't the ones you watch. They're the ones Suzanne Collins leaves in implication, in a single line of dialogue, or in entire storylines the movies decide not to touch at all. You think you know the arena because the cameras never blink. So why does it feel like there are whole parts of this world you're never allowed to look at directly? Why do the books keep hinting at things that happen off the stage? In basements, in prisons, in bedrooms, in labs? Why does every answer only raise another question about what this system is really doing to its people? Because this is where we talk about the horror that Panem doesn't broadcast. We're going to cover the secrets that sit just outside the frame, the victors who don't get parades so much as private appointments, the rebels who don't die in the square but simply vanish, the experiments that turn human beings into mutts and avoxes and hijacked weapons. There is a lot to uncover here, and most of it never makes it onto a single capital screen. Take Finnick. On TV, he's a golden boy with a trident and a smile. Off-screen, he has a second job the capital never advertises, sold to rich citizens with his loved ones used as collateral. Or think about the rebels who try to run and fail. The ones who don't make it to District 13 don't just get executed in public. Many of them end up tongueless, serving drinks at parties as avoxes, a permanent reminder of what happens when you try to escape. And then there's Snow. The books tell you he smells of blood and roses, and that part matters because it isn't just a quirky detail. It hints at poison, at constant bleeding, at a man so steeped in violence he has to drown it in perfume. If this is what you're allowed to know, what does his private punishment system look like when the cameras turn away? Even death isn't always the end. The capital engineers mutts from the DNA of dead tributes, twists prisoners into living weapons through hijacking, and keeps using people long after their bodies should have been allowed to rest. So here's the real question. Instead of asking, how brutal are the games, maybe we should be asking, what kind of system needs this much horror it won't televise? Because Panem sells the games as entertainment, built on fear and spectacle, yet it hides its worst crimes from the very audience it's trying to impress. Why would a regime that depends on terror be afraid of its own violence? That contradiction is where the real story is, in the off-screen space where Panem's true evil lives. And that's where we're headed next. Why the worst parts are off-screen, and why that's scarier. So when Panem hides its own violence, What are we actually missing? You see the games the way the Capitol wants you to. Careers charging through the forest, fireballs chasing a girl up a tree, mutts tearing into the final three at the cornucopia. Big, cinematic, very efficient trauma. But here's the real question. Why do the most disturbing things only show up in whispers, half-finished sentences, and characters shutting down mid-story? At face value, the arena is the horror, yet the narrative keeps nudging you toward what the cameras won't show. Avox is serving dinner in silence, the way Darius just disappears, the quiet mention that tongues are cut out. Finnick's friends in the Capitol, Johanna's time in custody, district punishments that never make it to Caesar Flickerman's highlight reel. We're going to cover specific off-screen moments later, but this is where we talk about the pattern. Why does Collins keep cutting away right when things get unbearable? Why do the films sand those edges down even more? Why are the most traumatized people in the story the ones whose worst memories we barely hear? There is a lot to uncover here, and none of it makes the Capitol's entertainment machine look controlled. It makes it look rabid, because for victors, the arena is not the climax, it's the audition. Finnick wins at 14, and Off-Page gets sold to Capitol elites, while Snow threatens the woman he loves. Johanna survives an axe and a bloodbath, only to be stripped, beaten and tortured with water in a Capitol cell. Haymitch outsmarts a force field, then crawls home to find his entire family murdered as payback. The games end, the crown is placed, the anthem plays. Then Snow starts calling in favors. The promise of victory is supposed to be safety. A house, food, your name out of the reaping. But that part matters because it's a lie that keeps every district invested in the system. The real relationship between Victor and Capitol is blackmail and ownership. You're exempt from the tesserae, but not from the phone that can ring at any hour with a new demand. You can't televise that without exposing the games as a recruitment pipeline for state-controlled victims. And here's where you come in as a reader or viewer. When Collins refuses to put the worst acts fully on the page, she hands the camera to your imagination. You have to fill in what hijacking actually feels like for Peter, what being turned into an box means for a runaway rebel, what happens in the labs that build mutts from human DNA. A PG 1-3 movie can show a fireball. Your brain can show you what it means to lose your voice forever. Once you start seeing those gaps, the stakes jump. Every Capitol smile looks rehearsed over someone else's pain. Every feast, every victory tour, every rose in Snow's garden feels like evidence from a crime scene you're only allowed to glimpse in fragments. If this is what they're willing to show, what are they hiding in the dark? And which off-screen moment is actually the worst thing the Capitol ever did? Our game plan, how we're unpacking Panem's dark corners. So to answer that last question, we need a game plan. Because the real horror of Panem isn't just kids in an arena. It's the system that makes that arena feel normal. At face value, the Hunger Games is already disturbing. You've got the reaping, the bloodbath, the cannons. But here's the real question. What kind of machinery has to exist off-screen to keep a country willingly feeding its children into that spectacle every single year? That's what we're going to cover in this episode. We're not just listing dark trivia from the books. This is where we talk about power, control, the everyday routines that turn cruelty into policy. For every moment the cameras show you a dramatic death, there's an entire hidden shift change of exploitation, experiments, and punishments that make sure the games run on time and the districts never forget who's in charge. So here's how we're going to unpack it. First, we go back before the arena into the districts themselves. What does life look like in District 12 when you're starving so badly you're hunting squirrels and trading on the black market? Why does a public whipping in the square work as a message for Snow in a way a single arena death never could? That part matters because it shows how the capital uses basic survival as a leash long before a child's name is ever pulled. Then we'll follow the people who try to slip that leash. Runaways, rebels, the ones who say no and disappear. Where do they actually go? We'll dig into avoxes, cut tongues, and vanished protesters, and ask why a silent servant at a capital table might be the most terrifying presence in the room. From there, we shift to the victors, the supposed success stories. What happens when the cameras switch off and the victor train pulls back into the district? Why does someone like Finnick, who seems adored, end up trafficked to capital elites with his loved ones used as collateral? There is a lot to uncover here about the relationship between reward and ownership and why Snow's promise of safety is always rigged. After that, we'll head straight into the capital's bioengineering lab. Mutations built from tribute DNA, experimental torture, hijacking Peter's mind with tracker-jacker venom. Why does the regime keep investing in new ways to break people when the old ways already work? What does that say about a government planning for rebellion decades in advance? We'll also look at the post-games fallout. Almost nobody talks about districts punished off-page, families targeted, victors like Johanna coming back half destroyed after water torture and conditioning. The games end, the retribution doesn't. All along, we'll keep flagging book versus movie differences. What got toned down, erased, or prettied up, and how that softens our sense of just how cruel Panem really is. And at the end, we'll rank the single most disturbing off-screen moment in the entire series, and run a thought experiment. If someone filmed a truly uncensored Hunger Games adaptation, what would you actually be able to watch without looking away? If you're new to the village, channel intro without the boring stuff. So if all of that already has you side-eyeing the screen and thinking, wait, what else are they not showing me? Then you're in the right district. This channel lives in the space between the frames. We treat Panem the way the capital never wanted you to, as a real authoritarian regime with a history, an economy, and a propaganda machine, not just a cool dystopian backdrop for arena highlight reels. At face value, the games are about kids in an arena. But here's the real question. What kind of government builds that arena, maintains it for 75 years, and then pretends it's just entertainment? There is a lot to uncover here. We're going to cover Snow's rise from ambitious student to the man who literally smells of blood and roses, the dark days that turned the map into 12 districts and a smoking crater where 13 used to be, and the quiet policies that keep everyone too hungry, too scared, or too entertained to fight back. If you've ever paused a rewatch because something felt off, because you sensed the movies were hiding something darker, you are exactly who this breakdown is made for. Think of the comments as our own little Victor's village, a tiny row of houses where the victors of rereads and obsessive rewatches drag each other onto the porch and compare scars. When did you realize Finnick was being trafficked? Which scene made you most suspicious about the avoxes? This is where we talk about theories, plug book details the films erased, and argue over which district had it worst without a peacekeeper showing up to break it up. And if you want to stay in the village long term, you can stick around for more than just this tour. We go deep on specific victors and what their lives really look like after the cameras cut. Finnick's forced prostitution, Johanna's torture and conditioning, Haymitch's quiet alcoholism as a political case study, not just a character quirk. We break down capital institutions, the game makers, the AVOX system, the mutation labs, as if they're real bureaucracies with budgets, failures, and internal politics. Why does the capital invest so much in psychological warfare instead of basic infrastructure? That part matters because it explains almost every choice they make. Soft promise here. If you want more on the political mechanics behind the games, how volunteering emerges in some districts and never in others, how tesserae and public whippings structure power, you know where to find us. But I promise the rest of this video is all meat, no filler. From here, we're going straight into the dark days, the rise of snow and the off-screen decisions, mutts, avoxes, disappeared rebels that quietly shape every frame you've already seen, ready to step outside the arena and into the regime that built it. Before the cameras, the dark days and the birth of a spectacle. So if the arena is already a nightmare, what kind of world has to exist before that for the Hunger Games to even sound reasonable? This is where we talk about the dark days, the part of Panem's history the capital turns into a single slide in a classroom presentation. Back then, there were no victors, no parades, no promise of a mansion on a hill. There was just open war. The districts rebelled, the capital hit back, and District 13 didn't just leave the conversation. It was bombed into radioactive ash on state television, or at least that's the story you're supposed to swallow. But here's the real question. Why invent something as elaborate as the games if simple annihilation worked so well on 13? The reason is that raw destruction only terrifies one generation. The capital needed a punishment that could be renewed yearly, a ritual that would keep every district in line without having to drop constant bombs. Before there were stylists and chariots, you can imagine the earliest games as barely games at all. No polished arenas, no betting odds, just public executions with a countdown clock. Tributes dragged into half-finished kill zones while their districts were already being starved, whipped, and shelled into submission off-screen. We're going to cover a lot of spectacle later, but the foundation is famine and fear. Districts are already on tesserae, already watching peacekeepers shoot people for stealing bread, long before Caesar Flickerman ever smiles into a camera. That part matters because it means the games don't create capital cruelty, they formalize it. They turn what used to be mass punishment into a scheduled event, with sponsors. What's wild is how little of this we actually see. Katniss only knows the propaganda version, map of Panem, quick voiceover, District 13 goes boom. In the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, you get a few more fragments, bombed out capital streets, half-starved students, a makeshift arena in a sports stadium. But even then, Collins keeps cutting away from the worst of it. The dark days live in ellipses and throwaway lines, which forces you to reconstruct the horror from gaps. Who got disappeared? Which districts were pacified? How many test mutts failed before the Jabberjays and Wolf mutts we actually meet? And once you've already wiped a district off the map, everything else becomes incremental. Cutting out tongues to make avoxes? That's just a small-scale dark days, selling victors' bodies to capital elites. The way Finnick later describes? That's simply another version of hostage-taking, moved from battlefields into bedrooms. The relationship between war and entertainment is the real horror here, the same toolbox of terror repackaged with better lighting. Now layer Snow onto that. Young Coriolanus grows up literally in the rubble of the rebellion, watching a clumsy, brutal version of the games that doesn't quite work. People are scared, sure, but they're not invested. There is a lot to uncover here, but the key lesson he learns is simple. Violence isn't enough. It has to be controlled, curated, turned into a story that offers just enough hope to keep people participating. So what happens when the boy who survived the dark days is handed the power to redesign the games from the ground up? That's where the off-screen cruelty gets disturbingly efficient. And where we go next. Snow's Invisible War. How a teen game maker learned to hide the blood. Snow's answer starts way before the fancy arenas and holograms. It starts in a crumbling stadium full of rubble, rabid rats, and bored capital citizens who aren't yet sure why they should care if some children from the districts die on screen. Back then, in the 10th Hunger Games, the arena isn't even really an arena. It's an old sports venue with no force field, no sponsors, barely any cameras, and zero promise of spectacle. You watch it in Ballad, and it feels wrong in a different way. It's brutal, but it's also sloppy. The capital hasn't figured out how to turn killing into a product yet. Here's the real question. What does a future dictator learn when he's forced to make that product sell? When Snow mentors Lucy Gray, he's technically just a student. But this is where we talk about his real education. He sees firsthand that at face value, pure brutality doesn't work. Tributes are starved in zoo cages, bombed before the games even start, and half the audience tunes out. Why? Because there's no narrative, no relationship between viewer and victim beyond disgust. So Snow experiments. He scripts Lucy Gray as a performer, pushes the romance angle, feeds the cameras a story of hope from a girl who should have none. He tampers with rule-breaking gifts, manipulates broadcasts, and edits what the capital sees in real time. That part matters because he's learning the core rule of Panem. People will accept almost anything if they feel they're choosing to watch it. But the other lesson is darker. When things go wrong, the bombing, the snakes, the deaths that weren't supposed to happen on camera, what does the administration do? They hide, deny, reframe. You can see the template forming. Public violence is for ratings. The real mistakes get buried. From that point on, Snow understands the danger of too much visible cruelty. The dark days taught him that open slaughter breeds rebellion. So he builds a double structure. On screen you get the games, the reaping the smiling victor interviews that promise a way out. Off screen you get the Avoxes with their tongues cut out, the disappeared rebels, the quiet executions that never make the recap. We're going to cover those systems later, but the blueprint is already there in Ballad. When a tribute misbehaves, punishment doesn't always happen in front of the cameras. When a mentor steps out of line, the consequences hit their family, their future, their record, off-screen, but very real. By the time we reach Katniss's era, Snow has perfected this invisible war. Victors are paraded on television, but coerced into prostitution in private. Districts see a glamorous tour. They don't see the threats whispered in train cars or the torture chambers beneath the capital. And once you understand Snow as the man who prefers invisible knives to public guillotines, All those missing details in the trilogy stop feeling accidental. The gaps are the point. If you can't quite prove the horror, you can't quite organize against it. So when something awful happens off-page, the better question isn't why didn't we see it? It's who decided we shouldn't? The starvation and violence the games don't show, so if the Capital's worst crimes are the ones you're not allowed to prove, where does that start for most people in Panem? Not in the arena. It starts in the districts where the baseline setting of life is already a slow-motion execution. District 12 is our clearest window into this. At face value, you see coal dust, shabby houses, kids with worn clothes. But the books make it clear, the real enemy there is hunger. People in the seam live one failed hunting trip away from death. You're told about families boiling weeds, about bloated bodies from malnutrition, about people simply lying down in their homes and not getting back up because there's no medicine and no food. That's not a disaster, that's Tuesday. Here's the real question. When survival is that fragile, what does punishment look like? You don't need a public beheading when you can just cut off someone's access to grain. Taking extra from the storehouses or slipping under the fence to hunt isn't minor theft in this system. It's treated as treason. We hear about people being whipped or disappearing after curfew violations, but Collins rarely walks you through every lash. The absence of detail is its own kind of threat. You know it's bad, you just don't know how bad. Gale's whipping and catching fire is one of the only times the curtain lifts. One moment he's dragged into the square, the next he's half conscious, his back shredded. That part matters because it's framed as an escalation, not an exception. Thread doesn't invent cruelty, he standardizes it. His arrival implies an entire off-page rulebook of curfews, surprise inspections, and routine corporal punishment that the seam has simply been lucky enough to dodge for a while. If this is what we see once, what does it look like when no merchant's daughter runs to get Hamish? And this is where we talk about Tesserae, the quiet engine behind the games. On paper, it's charity. Extra grain and oil in exchange for extra entries in the reaping. But why does that choice only exist for the poorest kids? Because hunger is the Capital's favorite contract. You sign with your stomach. Children in the seam aren't just at higher risk in the arena. They've already been coerced into a statistical death trap years before the cameras roll. The games start as an economic algorithm, not a gong in the sky. The films smooth a lot of this out. District 12's seam looks rough, sure, but you don't really see distended bellies or bodies pulled from mine collapses. The hob feels almost cozy instead of desperate. In the books, a mine explosion isn't a rare tragedy. It's part of the background noise. Another reason kids grow up knowing that war can kill you just as easily as the reaping. There is a lot to uncover here in the relationship between what the Capital broadcasts and what it edits away. By the time a tribute steps onto that stage in the Justice Building, they're not a blank slate. They're already a survivor of years of off-screen violence, starvation, beatings, disappearances. The constant question of whether breaking one more rule is worth one more meal. So when you watch them grab a backpack, form an alliance, or hesitate before killing, you're not just seeing strategy, you're seeing the echo of every whipping post and empty pantry back home. And if this is the baseline for a quiet district like 12, what happens when the Capital decides a district isn't quiet anymore? Runaways, rebels, and the making of an Avox. When a district stops being quiet, the capital doesn't just send more peacekeepers. It starts taking people's voices. This is where we talk about avoxes, because at face value they're just background staff in red uniforms, silently pouring drinks and clearing plates. But here's the real question. Why is silence such a big part of the capital's punishment system that they literally cut out tongues? There is a lot to uncover here, and almost all of it happens off-screen. In-universe, an avox is usually a runaway or a suspected rebel caught trying to escape Panem or defy capital control. Instead of executing them publicly, the regime performs a quieter execution. They remove speech, identity, and legal personhood in one move. You're not a citizen anymore. You're not even a prisoner with rights. You become a permanent servant in the capital, a human appliance that can see everything and say nothing. That part matters because it turns rebellion into a ghost story told through absence. Lavinia is our clearest window into this system, and even then, it's mostly fogged up. You remember her, the red-haired girl Katniss once saw in the woods, chased by a hovercraft begging for help. Katniss freezes. Gale pulls her back. The girl is taken. We never see the capture. We never see the punishment. Months later, Katniss walks into the training center, and there she is again, now an avox serving her dinner, tongue removed, name erased. We only know Lavinia from behind-the-scenes material. In the text, she doesn't even get that. So what's the psychological horror here? The capital doesn't just kill rebels, it recycles them. It turns them into furniture for the victors, stylists and game makers, the very people whose games and parties destroyed their lives. Every time Katniss reaches for a glass, an avox hand is already there. Every capital feast, every victory tour banquet, is staffed by the disappeared. The relationship is brutally ironic. The more the capital celebrates its power, the more it has to rely on the people it crushed to serve the champagne. And notice how the narrative mirrors the capital's strategy. We're going to cover mutts and torture and hijacking later, but the avox system is arguably just as disturbing because it's so easy to ignore. The books keep avoxes in the corners of scenes. The movies go even further, almost erasing them entirely. You might catch a quick shot, a hint of a scar, but no explanation. On-screen Panem treats avoxes the way the capital does. Always present, never acknowledged. Is that a mercy for the audience, or another layer of world-building cruelty? Pattern interrupt. What if every silent extra you see in the capital is actually a missing person from some district? If Lavinia is one, and Pollux in Mockingjay is another, how many more are there off-page? Hundreds? Thousands? Here's the real question. When you zoom out, what does Panem look like if every faceless servant is a failed escape attempt, a crushed rebellion, a stolen future with a missing tongue? The games might only pull 24 names a year, but the avox system suggests a second, invisible lottery, one that never ends and never lets you speak about what you lost. And if that's what happens to the people who run, what does the capital say for the ones who fight back and actually hurt it? The capital's secret lab, mutations and the dead who don't stay dead. So if rebellion earns you a collar and a missing tongue, what happens when you hurt the capital so badly it can't use you as a servant anymore? You don't disappear, you get recycled. This is where we talk about mutations. At face value, they're just scary animals in the arena. Dogs with too many teeth, birds that repeat what you say, lizard things that move too fast. But here's the real question. Why do they feel personal? Why do they feel targeted, almost familiar? In Panem, mutts aren't just creatures, they're weapons. Bioengineered tools the capital grows in some hidden facility, mixing animal traits with human DNA and behavioral conditioning. We never see the lab, we never meet the scientists, we just see the finished product unleashed in the games. That part matters because it tells you the capital doesn't only control bodies in the districts, it controls biology itself. Go back to the first book. The wolf mutts that chase the final 3 tributes onto the cornucopia. On the surface, they're just giant wolves. So why does Katniss recognize them? Why do their eyes look exactly like the dead tributes we've been watching all book? Same hair color, same builds. One has Glimmer's green eyes. Another has Rue's dark, wide stare. The text never flat out says, these are reanimated tributes, but the implication is brutal. Either the capital dug up their bodies, or it harvested their DNA the moment they died. So you're a tribute, you watch someone from your district die. Then, at the end, you're literally hunted by a distorted version of them. There is a lot to uncover here. The horror isn't just body desecration, it's psychological warfare. The capital turns victims into ongoing tools of terror. Death doesn't end your relationship with the games, it upgrades you into a weapon. And the wolf mutts are just one model. We're going to cover jabberjays for a second because they're an earlier prototype of the same cruelty. Originally, they're surveillance tech, birds engineered to memorize and repeat human speech so the capital can spy on rebels. When they're abandoned and breed with mockingbirds, you get mockingjays, the symbol of resistance. But before that accidental hope, jabberjays are already a horror experiment. In Catching Fire, they repeat the screams of loved ones in the clock arena, forcing tributes to relive trauma on command. Then you reach Mockingjay and the lizard mutts in the tunnels, human-sized, white-skinned, with near-human hands and a suggestion of speech. They're fast, coordinated, and specifically programmed to target Katniss's squad. You can feel the unseen trial and error behind them. How many failed versions did they make first? How many prisoners, rebels, or even captured victors were dissected, mapped, copied? So why don't we ever walk through that lab? Why doesn't Collins give us a clean torture montage in stainless steel? 2 reasons. In-universe, the capital needs that facility completely invisible, even to its own citizens. Out of sight, out of conscience. But on a story level, Collins knows your brain will fill in something worse. You imagine the restraints, the screaming, the clinical notes, the promise of scientific progress turned into a factory line of suffering. And if mutts are what the capital does with the dead and disappeared, what does it do with the ones who survive and still won't obey? The arena is only the audition, what victors owe after they win. The arena is sold as the nightmare. But the really disturbing twist is that for the victors, the arena is only the audition. You're told the story over and over. Win the games, get the house, never be hungry again. At face value, the capital's promise is simple. Survive once, and you're free forever. Here's the real question. Free to do what? And for whom? Because once you look past the marble countertops and hot showers, every victor is basically a salaried employee of a death show. They mentor new tributes. They ride the victory train, They smile through Capitol interviews year after year. We're going to cover the on-screen obligations we see, but there is a lot to uncover here in what we don't see. The contracts they never got to read, the clauses enforced with peacekeepers instead of lawyers. Mentoring sounds honorable until you remember what it actually means. You spend the rest of your life coaching children from your own district into strategies that will probably get them killed. You stand in the viewing room and watch them die because of your advice. Then you go on the victory tour, paraded through the districts, forced to praise the system that keeps feeding kids into the arena. That part matters because it turns every reward into another form of participation in the games. And that's just the visible stuff. The photo ops, the talk shows, the mandatory parties where victors are passed around Capitol elites as entertainment. The text never gives us a neat rule book, which is the point. The relationship between Victor and Capitol runs on unspoken threats. Snow doesn't need you to sign, he just needs you to know your family's address. This is where we talk about invisible debts. Snow uses what you love as collateral. We hear it outright with Finnick in Mockingjay. He's forced into sexual slavery, sold to Capitol citizens, with Snow dangling Annie's safety as the leverage. We're told it in a few horrifying lines. And then the narrative just moves on. Your brain fills in the years of abuse that never make it into any broadcast. Johanna's story works the same way. She refuses to play the Capitol's game, so they strip her, torture her, and condition her with water to break her. We never get the full footage, but we see the aftermath, the shaking, the rage, the way she flinches in training. You only react like that if there was a whole second set of games we never saw. Haymitch is the bridge between these two layers. On screen, he's the drunk mentor with a sharp tongue. In the books, his alcoholism is a survival strategy. He spent decades being forced to watch children die using his tactics, knowing that if he ever truly refuses, his district pays. What favors has he had to grant? What threats has he swallowed? The story leaves that off page, which somehow makes it worse. So when Snow reaches for the quarter quell and starts reaping from the pool of existing victors, he isn't just changing the rules of the arena, he's threatening to cash in every hidden debt at once. The real question is, what happens to a system built on invisible contracts when its most valuable victors finally decide the bill is too high? Finnick Odair's real price: sexual slavery in the Capitol's shadows. So when the bill finally comes due for the victors, Finnick Odair is the cautionary tale the Capitol never airs. On screen, he's the golden boy with the trident. Off-page, Mockingjay quietly hands you the invoice. At 14, he wins the games and is crowned the Capitol's favorite new toy. Mansions, fame, endless attention. At face value, it looks like the system working. A poor kid from a fishing district turned celebrity. But here's the real question. What exactly is the Capitol paying him for? Finnick answers it himself in that bitter, almost throwaway monologue in Mockingjay. Snow starts sending offers from wealthy Capitol citizens who want private time with their new victor. When Finnick refuses, Snow doesn't threaten him directly. He threatens the people back home. His family, Annie. Every no becomes a death sentence for someone in District 4. So Finnick says yes, again and again, until his body is no longer his, it's inventory. We never see any of this happen. That part matters because it's almost entirely off-screen horror. The books give you Finnick's words, his deadpan delivery, and then just move on. The films go even softer. No explicit explanation, no direct mention of sexual slavery, just hints of trauma under the charm. You're left to connect the dots, and if you don't, the capital's ugliest economy stays invisible. But once you know, catching fire rewrites itself in your head. All those sugar cubes and winks, suddenly they're not vanity, they're armor. Flirtation becomes a survival strategy, a way to control the terms of a transaction he never agreed to in the first place. He leans into the role the capital wrote for him because the alternative is watching snow hurt the people he loves. There is a lot to uncover here about the relationship between performance and coercion, and Finnick makes it clear he's not unique. I wasn't the only one, he says. Other victors are sold the same way. The promise of Victor's village, safety, comfort, freedom from the reaping, turns out to be a pipeline into trafficking, all run through Snow's private ledger. The capital pretends not to see it, because why would they question a system that delivers both entertainment and access? This is where we talk about the gap between book and film. The movies keep Finnick charming and tragic, but they never say the quiet part out loud. Without that detail, the capital's depravity gets rounded off, and casual viewers can walk away thinking the real damage ended in the arena. But once you hear his story, you can't unhear it. Every capital admirer screaming his name, every sponsor gift, every glossy interview is stained by the knowledge that he's been commodified since he was a child. And it raises a darker question. If this is what they do to their beloved victors, what happens to the people they don't need to keep pretty? Johanna Mason. Torture stripping and a mind rewired by fear. So when you hear that question, what happens to the people the capital doesn't need to keep pretty? You don't have to imagine a hypothetical. You just have to look at Johanna Mason. At face value, Johanna is the angry, sarcastic victor who rips off her clothes in an elevator and glares through every interview. But here's the real question. How do you turn someone that feral and fearless into a shaking, water-phobic wreck we meet in Mockingjay? The answer never makes it onto the screen, but the books quietly hand you the file. After the quarter quell, Johanna is captured along with Peter and the others who don't make it out. We're told, in a few brutal, almost throwaway lines, that she was stripped, beaten, and tortured with water in the capital. Not drowned once, conditioned. Over and over, water equals agony. So when you see her later in District 13's training center, freezing in the shower, panicking during the water-based obstacle course, that part matters because you're not watching a quirky fear. You're watching a weaponized association, and we never actually see it happen. The films cut from the arena explosion to aftermath. The books give you fragments, not scenes, so you're left with the result. Johanna bawled, shaking, furious, unable to complete basic tasks, lashing out at everyone. We're going to cover the capital's mutation labs and hijacking later, but this is the same pattern. You, as the audience, have to reverse engineer the torture from the damage. What did they do to her body? What did they say to her while they did it? The story refuses to show you, and that refusal is its own kind of horror. This is where we talk about symbolic cruelty. Johanna's whole identity is built around defiance and control over her body. In her original games, she pretends to be weak and harmless, hides her real skill, and then turns on the other tributes when it counts. Her body is her tool, her secret, her advantage. So what does the capital do when she rebels? They strip her naked, they expose her, they beat that autonomy out of her, then lace her most basic human need, water, with terror. It's not random, it's targeted. The relationship between who she is and how they hurt her is the point. The movies hint at this but pull back hard. You get the shaved head, the haunted eyes, the shaking hands, the way she snaps at Katniss and can't handle the rain in training. If you've only seen the films, you might file it under generic PTSD and move on. The specific water torture? Never mentioned. The reason showers are a battleground for her? Off-screen, off-hand, almost off-canon, unless you've read closely. And Johanna isn't an exception. She's a template. Rebels and disobedient victors aren't simply executed because death is too quick and too private. They're turned into living warnings. Their minds are rewritten, their bodies altered, and then they're paraded on talk shows, in propaganda reels, in carefully staged hospital wings, as proof of what happens when you break the rules. The games promise one victor, one hope. But the Capital's real game is what happens after. If they can do this to Johanna, a trained killer with nothing left to lose, what does that say about everyone else still trapped under Snow's roses and cameras? Haymitch, chaff, and the quiet epidemic of victor self-destruction. And that's where Haymitch suddenly stops being funny. You're told to read his drinking as comic relief, as the grumpy mentor who falls off the stage and sleeps in his own vomit. But here's the real question. What kind of arena produces a victor who has to stay drunk for 25 years just to keep mentoring? There is a lot to uncover here once you stop treating the bottle as a punchline. Haymitch's games are some of the most sadistic in the entire canon. A force field around the edge of the cliff, a twist he only survives because he figures out the physics and throws the axe back at the Capitol. That part matters because Snow's response is not just, "You outsmarted us," it's, "You embarrassed us on camera." The punishment is off-screen. His mother, his little brother, his girlfriend, all killed after he gets home. So when you see him in District 12's Victor's Village, surrounded by empty bottles, that's not random weakness. That's a man living in a house the Capitol effectively filled with ghosts. And then he has to train children every single year. He watches them die in arenas he knows too well, while the Capitol beams his reactions out as entertainment. You think back to those scenes on the train, the way he shuts down, the way he only engages when Katniss and Peter force him to. So why does he drink? Why wouldn't he? The real horror is that this is the closest thing Panem has to mental health care. This is where we talk about chaff too. He's missing a hand, he's openly drunk at the Quarter Quell. He kisses Katniss in this weird, boundary-ignoring way. At face value, it reads as, "Oh, another messy victor." But the pattern is everywhere. Johanna lashing out, Beatty disappearing into wires, Finnick with his sugar cubes and secrets. We're going to cover the sexual coercion more later, but you already see the outline. A whole culture in Victor's Village where self-destruction is normal, even expected. Why doesn't anyone step in? Why is there no therapist on the train, no debriefing room, no institutional care for the people the games supposedly honor? Because a stable, sober victor is dangerous. A drunk, erratic one is easy to dismiss. If Haymitch ever tried to testify about what really happens in Snow's mansion, or in those private capital parties, the capital can just point to the flask and say, he's crazy, he's ungrateful, he's damaged. So the relationship between Victor's village and addiction is strategic. The cameras show the parties, the interviews, the stylists. The real breakdowns happen in locked bathrooms, in dark kitchens, in those huge empty beds where the nightmares hit. You only ever see the tip of the iceberg, a snapped comment, a slammed door, a shaking hand. But how many nights of panic attacks, threats, and quiet coercion sit underneath every outburst? And if this is what the capital lets you see of its winners, what's hiding in the houses, the basements, and the records you never hear about? Family as hostage. How Snow punishes loved ones we never meet. So when you ask what's hiding in those basements and records, the answer is ugly. It's people. Or more specifically, the people victors care about. This is where we talk about Snow's favorite leverage. He doesn't need to chain every victor to a cell when he can quietly put a metaphorical gun to their mother's head, their little brothers, their first loves. At face value, you see a handful of traumatized celebrities in big houses. But here's the real question. Why are almost all of them so obedient, so careful, for decades? Snow's solution is simple. You win the games, he wins your address book. We're going to cover Finnick first because he's the clearest example the books actually spell out. On the surface, he's the capital's golden boy, charming, adored, draped in nets and sugar cubes. Off-screen, he's being sold to capital citizens, and the price of saying no isn't his own life. It's Annie Cresta. It's anyone back in District 4 he's ever shown the slightest attachment to. He tells Katniss that Snow makes his threats in the most personal way possible, and that part matters because it implies a whole invisible enforcement system. You don't see the peacekeepers walking into some fishing village shack at midnight. You just know Finnick never risks testing him. Haymitch is the same strategy, turned up to 11 and then buried in a single paragraph. He outsmarts the arena with the force field, embarrasses the capital on live TV, and for a second you think, wow, someone actually beat the system. The punishment? Snow has his mother, his younger brother, and his girlfriend killed. Not arrested, not publicly executed, just erased. Quietly. Permanently. One day they exist, the next they don't. The message is so precise you can practically hear it. You're free to drink yourself to death, Haymitch, but never again mistake survival for power. Once you realize that, rebellion looks very different. Every act of defiance isn't just, will I die for this? It's who else am I willing to put on the chopping block? You mentor a tribute to, honestly, you hesitate on camera, you form the wrong relationship with another victor, and somewhere a door in your district opens to peacekeepers. No announcement, no trial, no body, just absence. How do you organize an uprising when the capital can delete your sister and then pretend she never existed? And here's the twist the films mostly skip. Without this personalized terror campaign, Snow reads as a distant dictator, an abstract threat in a white rose garden. On the page, he's much smaller and much worse. A man who memorizes your family tree and uses it as a weapon. There is a lot to uncover here about how control really works in Panem, because once you see that pattern with victors, you have to ask, how many ordinary district families are being held hostage the same way? Hold that thought, because the next layer of off-screen horror is what happens to the people who try to run instead of obey. Itch hijacking Peter, the science fiction torture we only glimpse. Running doesn't save you. Sometimes it turns you into something worse. This is where we talk about hijacking. On the surface, Peter is rescued from the arena after catching fire. At face value, you'd expect the Capitol to parade him, punish him, maybe execute him. But here's the real question. Why invest time, science, and resources into turning one captured victor into a weapon? The answer pulls us straight into one of the most disturbing off-screen projects in Panem. Hijacking is the Capitol's sci-fi torture program. They take Tracker venom, the same hallucinogenic poison that sends Katniss into nightmares in the first games, and combine it with controlled memory exposure. Over and over, they flood Peter's brain with images of Katniss, then chemically twist the emotional tags attached to those memories. Love becomes terror. Safety becomes threat. The relationship that kept him alive in the arena is literally rewritten into something that wants her dead. There is a lot to uncover here, and most of it never makes it on screen. Peter disappears at the end of Catching Fire, screaming as he's pulled away on the hovercraft. Then in Mockingjay, he just reappears, thin, shaking, and weaponized. We get a handful of references to the lab, to doctors, to sessions. That part matters because the gaps are where your imagination starts doing the work the camera refuses to do. How many sessions did it take to break his sense of self? How many times did they show him the bread in the rain and tell his nervous system, this is when she tried to kill you? And this isn't just torture in the physical sense, it's identity theft. The Capitol doesn't only want to punish Peter for defying the script on live television, they want to repurpose him, turn a symbol of hope from District 12 into a booby-trapped gift for the rebellion. When he warns Katniss on Caesar's show, is that the real boy with the bread slipping through? Or just another line in their experiment? The question hangs over every scene he's in. The films let you see the aftermath, the choking, the restraints, the way he has to be treated as a mutt more than a patient. But they sanitize the clinical horror the books hint at, the restraints on the table, the white-clad technicians, the repeated injections of venom, the careful recording of what image finally makes him snap. It's not rage, it's research. And hijacking isn't an isolated nightmare, it's part of a pattern we're going to cover across Panem's darkest corners. Mutations, avoxes, hijacked victors, different tools, same project. Take a human being, strip out the inconvenient parts, and keep whatever is useful to the Capitol. A tribute's DNA becomes a hound in the arena. A runaway's voice is cut out so they can serve in silence. A baker's son is hollowed and refilled as a weapon pointed at the girl on fire. So if this is what they do to someone the world is watching, what happens to the people no one remembers at all? Why doesn't the Capitol show this, the logic of hidden cruelty? So here's the paradox that should make you stop. The Capitol will broadcast a child getting speared through the stomach in HD, but they won't show you an AVOX. If the games exist to terrify the districts, wouldn't airing the torture rooms, the hijacking labs, the sexual slavery of victors make the Capitol even scarier? Why hide the worst parts of the system that's supposedly built on fear? At face value, it feels inefficient. You've already built a nightmare. Why not turn all the lights on? Here's the real question. Who is the audience the Capitol cares about most? It's not just the districts, it's the Capitol citizens themselves. Snow needs two things at once that are in constant tension: district terror and capital complicity. That part matters because you can't keep the games running if your own viewers start seeing themselves as villains instead of fans. So this is where we talk about audience management. The capital essentially runs two different broadcasts. For the districts, the games are a threat. Obey, or this is your child. For the capital, they're a spectacle. Costumes, interviews, Caesar's commentary. We're going to cover the brutality in the arena, sure, but only the kind that can be framed as sport. You see blood, but you don't see the peacekeeper who starved a family in District 11 last week. Some violence is too destabilizing even for a dictatorship. Public whippings, those can be spun as law and order, but openly televising Finnick being sold to capital elites, or Johanna stripped and tortured in a cell, that crosses the line from harsh but necessary system into we are monsters. Once capital viewers see an Avox up close and know that's a runaway whose tongue was cut out, the relationship between them and their servants changes. Suddenly, the party has a body count. Snow can't risk that. He needs capital citizens to believe the games are cruel but contained, a necessary evil with clear rules. That's the promise. If you play along, the horror stays on screen, far away. Show them mutation labs built on dead tributes' DNA, or hijacking sessions where Peter is broken and rewired, and the illusion that we're just watching a show collapses. Keeping the worst cruelty off screen also lets the capital gaslight everyone. If no one ever sees the torture, officials can dismiss stories as rebel propaganda or Victor's trauma as exaggeration. Avoxes become rumors, not evidence. Sexual coercion of victors becomes whispered scandal, not documented crime. It's horror that exists in the shadows, which means Snow can always say, "Prove it." And underneath all of this is Snow's favorite tool: hope. The games aren't just about fear, they're about a twisted hope that you could win, that your district might get food, that your victor might really be safe in that mansion. If the full cost of victory, prostitution, hijacking, retribution against families were common knowledge, the promise of the games disintegrates. Why play along if winning doesn't save you? So the capital hides its worst acts for the same reason it builds shining trains and glittering arenas, to make sure you still want something from it. But what happens when a victor starts dragging those hidden horrors into the light? On live TV, where Snow can't edit fast enough, hope, fear, and the Snow Crane rulebook for controlled horror, Katniss dragging those horrors onto Caesar's couch, is dangerous for one reason Snow has already explained to us. Hope. You remember that quiet garden scene in the first film, the one that almost slips past you, because no one's bleeding. Snow tells Seneca Crane, "Hope. It is the only thing stronger than fear." At face value, it sounds almost compassionate, like he's defending the district's spirit. But here's the real question. Why is a dictator talking about hope as if it's a resource he can manage on a spreadsheet? Snow finishes the thought. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. There is a lot to uncover here. He's laying out the rulebook for controlled horror. The games must terrify you enough that you'll obey, but still promise just enough escape that you keep playing. The relationship between hope and fear becomes a kind of emotional mutation he's engineered for the whole country. This is where we talk about the off-screen brutality. If people in every district knew exactly what happened to victors after the cameras cut, Finnick's prostitution, Johanna's torture, Haymitch's family being wiped out. The Little Hope calculation collapses. Why volunteer if the games don't actually end? Why believe the Capitol's promise that a crown means safety when the real prize is lifelong blackmail and trauma? So the system splits reality in two. The visible half is parades, feasts, Victor's village, that gleaming train. The invisible half is addiction, forced sex, hijacking, and disappeared relatives. The Capitol has to hide how miserable a victor's life actually is, or the fantasy of winning stops working. That part matters because the games aren't just punishment, they're recruitment. They need new tributes who still think, on some level, maybe it could be me. Capitol citizens have to believe they're watching a glamorous tradition, not a war crime streamed annually. They see couture interviews, stylists, fireworks. They don't see avoxes whose tongues were cut out for running, or the labs where mutts are grown from human DNA. Even for them, the ugliest parts stay behind closed doors. Fear is outsourced to the districts. Spectacle is what keeps the Capitol sleeping at night. Here's the real question. Whose perspective are we trapped in? Collins locks us inside Katniss's limited view, so we only glimpse what Snow is hiding through rumors, breakdowns, and slip-ups. On live TV, off-screen space in Panem isn't just a gap in the story. It's a political weapon. In universe, it keeps hope carefully rationed. On the page, it keeps us aware that something worse is always just out of frame. And once you realize the horror is being curated, not just committed, you start to wonder, what else are we not being shown yet? What the movies don't dare show? Adaptation choices and sanitized evil. So if the books are already playing this game of strategic omission, what happens when you run that through a PG? 1.3 blockbuster filter? You get a second layer of censorship, a curated horror that's been curated again. At face value, the movies feel brutal. Kids kill kids. There's blood, explosions, screaming. But here's the real question. Why do some of the most disturbing canon details never even get a name on screen? Finnick's entire story of being sold to Capitol elites is boiled down to a couple of haunted looks and one vague line about secrets. You never hear that Snow threatens loved ones to force victors into sexual slavery. That part matters because it turns victory itself into a long-term sentence, not just a traumatic memory. Same thing with the Avoxes. In the books, you learn they're runaways and rebels, tongues cut out, turned into living warnings. In the films, they're just there, silent background staff. No explanation, no relationship to rebellion, no explicit mention that this is what happens when you try to escape your district. Without that context, the Capitol's cruelty shifts from systematic punishment to set dressing. And then there are the mutts and the torture. The books heavily imply that mutts are made from tribute DNA and prisoners, that the Capitol literally recycles dead kids into weapons. The films keep the monsters but skip the implication. Johanna's torment in the Capitol. On the page, she's stripped, beaten, and conditioned with water until even a shower is a trigger. On screen, you get a shaved head, some scars, and a very PG 1.3 breakdown. We're going to cover why that softening changes how you read the whole war. The obvious reason is rating. A PG 1.3 movie can show stylized death in the arena, but sexual violence, mutilation as punishment, and prolonged psychological torture of prisoners, that crosses the invisible line. So the adaptation leans into spectacle. Big explosions are acceptable. A 14-year-old coerced into prostitution for capital parties is not. The games stay visually violent, but the off-screen abuse that keeps victors compliant is mostly erased. And when you pull those threads, the tone shifts. The capital becomes cartoonishly decadent instead of systemically predatory. Snow turns into a distant mastermind with a signature drink, not the man personally arranging who gets sold, who gets hijacked, whose tongue gets cut out. You still understand that he's evil. You just don't see the intimate, hands-on nature of that evil. To be fair, the films do sneak in visual nods. Avoxes gliding through the background, Snow's roses paired with blood, hinting at the stench he uses to cover the sores in his mouth. But without the book's commentary, those are Easter eggs, not threats. You don't feel the promise, this is what happens when you step out of line. So imagine a more faithful adaptation, not necessarily more graphic, but more honest about what's happening when the cameras cut away from the arena. What if we actually heard Finnick's full story on screen? What if an Avox wasn't just a silent extra, but someone Katniss recognizes? There is a lot to uncover here, because once you restore those missing pieces, the games stop being a deadly show and become what they really are, the surface of a much deeper punishment system. And if the surface is already that lethal, what does that say about the foundations underneath it? This is where we talk about what winning, rebelling, or even surviving really costs you in Panem. Blood and roses. The off-screen story behind Snow's signature smell. If the foundations are rotten, how do you hide the smell? In Panem, the answer is, you don't fix the rot, you perfume it. And nobody embodies that more literally than President Snow. You keep hearing it in the books, the scent of blood and roses. Katniss notices it in his breath, in the air after he leaves, in the garden where he casually threatens her family. At face value, it sounds poetic, almost theatrical. But here's the real question. Why blood? Why is that detail so specific, so persistent that Collins keeps bringing it back? This is where we talk about the off-screen story the movies skip and the early books only hint at. Long before he's the terrifying face of the games, young Coriolanus Snow is a desperate, ambitious capital student. In his rise to power, he poisons a political rival. That part we can imagine on screen. The glass, the toast, the quiet collapse. But the crucial horror, it happens after. To avoid suspicion, Snow has to drink some of the same poison himself. Then he has to keep ingesting tiny doses over time, so no one can point to a single incident. The cure becomes a second, slower weapon. Only this time, it's turned inward. The poison permanently destroys the inside of his mouth. His sores never fully heal. His gums bleed. His breath carries the metallic tang of his own self-inflicted damage. So now you have the president of Panem, the man who controls every reaping and every victor, walking around with the constant taste of blood in his mouth. What does he do? He doesn't seek redemption. He seeks cover. He surrounds himself with roses, wears them, grows them, uses them to flood the air so no one can smell what's actually happening to him. There is a lot to uncover here, because the symbolism is almost too on the nose. Snow's entire rule is about covering rot with beauty. The games are framed as pageantry, fashion, and spectacle over children killing each other. Victor's village is a luxury suburb over lifelong surveillance and trauma, and Snow himself is a bleeding wound wrapped in carefully bred roses. That part matters because it shows you the relationship between his image and his reality. Corruption literally perfumed into something the Capitol can applaud. Notice how we never see the poisoning scene in real time. It's all retrospective, revealed later, when we're already trapped in his system. That distance mirrors how Snow operates. His worst decisions are always one step removed from the public eye. The poison is in the glass, but not in the broadcast. The mutts are in the arena, but the labs that made them stay off screen. And once you know this story, every mention of roses shifts. When Katniss smells them in her Victor's Village house after District 12 is bombed, it isn't just a calling card, it's a quiet reminder of every unseen body he's stepped over, every rival and rebel he's poisoned, directly or through the games, to keep his promise of control. So the next question is, if his breath is this haunted, what does that say about the rooms we never see and the people who never make it back from them? Peacekeepers, whips and disappearances, everyday terror in the districts. Those rooms we never see don't just exist in the capital. They're scattered through every district street, behind every locked door with a peacekeeper posted outside. You watch the games and think the horror is contained by an arena. But here's the real question. What has to be happening at home to make people quietly send their children there every year? This is where we talk about peacekeepers as more than background extras at the reaping. On paper, they're just law enforcement. At face value, they keep order, stop crime, maintain peace. In practice, they control the food lines, decide who gets punished for poaching, who's allowed to move after curfew, whose black market bread disappears before it ever reaches a starving family. The games are one spectacle. The peacekeepers are the daily reminder that the Capitol's promise of safety is conditional. You get a glimpse of it in District 12 with Gale's whipping. One man, one post, one lash turning into many. The camera cuts. The book pulls back. But that part matters because it tells you whippings aren't rare, they're routine. Public hangings, stocks, floggings, these are events children grow up watching on the same square where they watched their first reaping. You're supposed to internalize that relationship, disobey, and your body becomes another lesson. Rue's home is described as heavily guarded, fences actually powered, rules brutally enforced. When Katniss gives Rue that salute, you see a spark of hope travel through the crowd, and then a man is shot for responding. We glimpse the riot. We do not see the aftermath. Why? Because if one spontaneous moment of grief earns bullets, what do you think happens after the cameras leave? Mass arrests, work quotas doubled, food rations cut, entire families quietly removed. There is a lot to uncover here, and the story deliberately lets your imagination fill in the worst-case scenario. And who's doing all this? Not locals. Peacekeepers are usually shipped in from other districts, often from places with better conditions. That distance is the point. It's easier to break a stranger's jaw than your neighbor's. But it raises its own question. What happens to the peacekeeper who hesitates, who slips someone extra grain, who refuses to fire into a crowd? We never get a tour of their prisons or firing squads, but the fear you see among peacekeepers themselves suggests those systems absolutely exist. Over all of this hangs the constant threat of disappearing. The teacher who spoke too freely, the vendor who shorted the Capitol on taxes, the kid who climbed the fence and didn't come back. No trial, No announcement, just absence. It implies labor camps, underground cells, execution pits we never visit, because seeing them would make the games redundant. And that's the reason this invisible terror matters to the story. The arena only works because every tribute has already been living in a slow-motion version of it. If your district wasn't primed by curfews, whips, and vanishing neighbors, would the games really keep you obedient, or would they spark open revolt? Hold that thought, because the next piece of off-screen horror answers exactly how the Capitol deals with people who still choose to run. Dark Days 2.0. What the Capitol does to failed rebels. So when someone still chooses to run or to raise 3 fingers in the air anyway, what happens next? You see the gunshot in the square, the peacekeepers, the chaos. But here's the real question. What happens after the cameras cut away and the anthem stops playing? We only get a handful of on-page rebels. The man in District 11 who's shot for saluting Katniss. The crowd that answers Rue's family with the Mockingjay sign. The protesters in Catching Fire who do the same on Caesar's stage before they're dragged out. And the patients in District 8's hospital who cheer so loudly that Snow orders the entire building bombed. At face value, it looks contained. A few brave outbursts, a few troublemakers. But if multiple districts are erupting on screen, how many more are being crushed off screen where the Capitol doesn't have to pretend it's merciful? This is where we talk about consequences. The books give us hints, then pull away. You hear about public whippings, about executions in the square. You see a man hanged in District 12, left as a warning. But the really disturbing fates are the ones that are implied, not described. Avoxes are runaways whose tongues have been cut out. That part matters because it quietly answers a question the story never spells out. Where do failed escapees go? They don't go home. They become furniture in the Capitol, pouring wine for the very people who paid to watch their district's children die in the games. And that's just the visible punishment. Underneath, there is a lot to uncover here. We know the Capitol uses human DNA to build mutts, that hijacking exists, that Johanna and Peter are only 2 of many prisoners broken and rewired. If the Capitol can turn victors into weapons, why wouldn't it do the same to nameless rebels? The arena wolf mutts that look eerily like the dead tributes, the jabberjays that weaponize screams, the trackerjacker venom that distorts memory. Those aren't one-off science projects. They're a research pipeline. You have to ask, how many captured rebels ended up as test subjects whose stories literally never had a chance to be told? Zoom out even further. The biggest off-screen punishment in the entire series is District 13. For 3/4 of the narrative, everyone believes the Capitol annihilated an entire district for rebellion. No survivors. No ruins you can visit. Just a charred wasteland on a map and a yearly reminder during the games that this is what happens when you step out of line. Snow doesn't just threaten death, he threatens erasure is possible. Behavior changes. If rebellion means not only that you die but that your body disappears, your name becomes illegal to say, your family is reassigned, what do? You keep your head down. You pretend not to see. You don't even ask why your neighbor's house is suddenly empty. The relationship between terror and silence is the Capitol's favorite equation. Here's the pattern interrupt. Katniss's rebellion works. But the trilogy we read is one story that survived out of how many failed uprisings? For every District 13 that secretly escaped underground, how many districts, towns, or work crews tried something small, sabotaging a train, refusing a quota, and were wiped out so efficiently that no song, no mockingjay, no rumor remains. The games sell you the promise that any tribute could become a victor. The dark mirror is that any rebel can become an avox, a mutt, or a cautionary tale that never even makes it to a screen. So when you watch Panem finally rise, you're also watching the exception prove the rule. Most revolts didn't get an arena, a broadcast, or a mockingjay to narrate them. They got the quiet, efficient violence of a system that's had decades to perfect disappearing people. And if that's the cost of failure, what does it mean that the capital starts aiming that same machinery at its own victors next? District 12's mine explosions and accidents that aren't accidents. So when that machinery turns on victors, you notice it. But what about the people it's been grinding down quietly for decades? This is where we talk about District 12's mines. Because the arena isn't the only place in Panem where people die for the capital's power. On paper, the mines are just a job. Coal goes out, food rations come in, and the games roll on. At face value, it's background world building. Men go down before dawn, come back covered in black dust, and everyone treats explosions, cave-ins, and toxic air as normal. But each accident is a mass casualty event. Dozens of workers buried or burned, and none of those deaths ever make it onto Capitol screens. No anthem, no cannon. Just a line in a report and a few extra orphans in the seam. We're going to cover Katniss's father here because his death is framed as one of those routine tragedies. The mine blows. He doesn't come home. End of story. But here's the real question. In a regime where the capital can engineer mutts, build force fields, and control the weather in an arena, why can't it keep a coal mine from exploding? The answer is that safety is a political choice, and Snow chooses not to spend that capital on people who will never be victors, never be on camera, and never threaten his position. That part matters because neglect becomes a form of slow, deniable violence. You don't have to order executions if you can just let the equipment rust and the gas detectors fail. You don't need a firing squad when Black Lung will do the job over 20 years. And the narrative reflects that invisibility. We don't see the bodies pulled from the rubble. We don't see mass funerals. We barely even sit with the long-term health damage, the coughing, the shortened lifespans that keep District 12 trapped in generational poverty. So why does that work so well for Snow? Because those unseen deaths push people toward the capital's solutions. You're starving because your father died in the mines. Take Tesserae, risk the reaping. Hope your child becomes a victor so your family can finally escape. The relationship between industrial danger and the games is tight. The more precarious work becomes, the more the arena's false promise of salvation starts to look rational. In modern terms, this is structural violence, systems that kill without a single bullet being fired. It fits Snow's preference for cruelty that doesn't look like cruelty. A mine collapse can be blamed on bad luck. A poisoned water supply can be written off as a local issue. Peacekeepers don't even have to show up. And when you add it all together, every unseen mining death, every whipping in the square, every family starving off screen, the annual Hunger Games start to look less like the main event and more like a flashy highlight reel of a massacre that never pauses. So if the mines are one invisible arena, What do you do with the people who try to run from that system and get turned into something even more disturbing? Capital citizens, willful blindness, and the luxury of not knowing. On paper, that sounds horrific enough. But here's the real question. How do you run an entire capital city full of people who bump into those mutilated servants at every party and somehow still sleep at night? This is where we talk about the capital as a bubble. You're surrounded by constant entertainment, cosmetic surgery on demand, themed parties every week. Every surface is glossy, every screen is a distraction. The games aren't a crime. They're programming. At face value, a tribute parade is just fashion. A bloodbath is just ratings. The districts become distant names attached to aesthetics, coal, lumber, luxury, rather than real communities where peacekeepers are whipping people in the square. There is a lot to uncover here, because that lifestyle isn't an accident. The reason the capital can host those extravagant viewing parties is that the media has already done the cleaning for them. Broadcasts are edited. Commentary is sanitized. You never see a tribute starving to death in slow motion if it makes the wrong kind of audience uncomfortable. When Rue dies, the cameras give you the tragic music, the tasteful close-up, the cutaway to Caesar's solemn face. What you don't see is District 11 erupting, or the way that grief festers into rebellion. And the AVOXs? They're the ultimate off-screen horror standing in plain sight. You're told not to ask questions. No one on television ever mentions that they were runaways or rebels, that their tongues were cut out as punishment. Any hint of origin gets sliced out in the editing bay so a servant can refill champagne without disturbing the mood. That part matters because it proves the ignorance isn't just imposed from above. It's curated to feel polite. But is it really just ignorance? Cinna clearly knows more. Plutarch definitely knows more. Even Effie Trinket, with her obsessive focus on manners, flinches at certain moments. If some capital citizens can see through the gloss, that means others have had chances to notice and chose not to. Willful blindness becomes a survival strategy. You hear rumors about victors being favored by important people, but you don't follow Finnick's thread far enough to reach sexual slavery. You notice how Haymitch drinks himself into oblivion, but you never ask why the capital's promise of glory created so many addicts. Every now and then, the bubble trembles, Katniss covering Rue in flowers. The silent salute from District 11, the berry stunt that turns the games from triumph into near-mass casualty event for the capital's favorite show. For a second, you can feel the audience's unease. Did we just watch the beginning of something we can't control? And then, immediately, the narrative spin kicks in. Star-crossed lovers, a romantic misunderstanding. Nothing to see here. So, why does it work? Because for many capital citizens, the horror is tolerable as long as it stays off screen and doesn't interrupt the party. The relationship between spectacle and cruelty becomes a deal everyone silently signs. We won't ask where the blood goes, if you keep the roses fresh, but what happens when the off-screen horror refuses to stay off-screen anymore, and the games start coming home? Coin, District 13, and the rebellion's own off-screen sins. When the games come home, they don't land in the capital first, they land in an underground bunker that keeps insisting it's the moral high ground. On paper, District 13 is everything the capital isn't. No excess, no parties, no televised slaughter. At face value, it's disciplined, egalitarian, the good side of the war. Everyone gets rations, Everyone works. Everyone matters. But here's the real question. If 13 is so transparent and fair, why does almost everything important happen out of sight in command rooms and sealed corridors you never really see? This is where we talk about President Coin. We never watch the planning session where she signs off on bombing Capitol children at Snow's mansion. We aren't in the room when someone suggests using a false flag strike, or when Coin decides to mirror the parachute bombs from the arena. We just see the white parachutes, the medics rushing in, Prim stepping forward, and then the explosion. The decision itself lives off screen, which is exactly how the Capitol handles its worst atrocities. There is a lot to uncover here, because that part matters because it tells you Coin doesn't just want to win the war. She's willing to use the same playbook the enemy wrote, and framing it on Snow's remaining forces, that's a game's move. Kill children, then weaponize the grief. You're not supposed to ask how long that plan was in motion, or who else in 13 knew. The story is carefully edited before it ever reaches the surface. You see the same pattern in how 13 treats its star rebel. Katniss isn't just a victor, she's a resource. From the moment she arrives, she's medicated, evaluated, and slotted into a schedule down to the minute. When she breaks down, it's in hospital rooms and storage closets, never in front of the cameras. We're going to cover the propos, the stage ruins, the carefully framed shots where she becomes a Mockingjay on command. The relationship between Katniss and Coin is basically a quieter version of Katniss and Snow. Different rhetoric, same need to control the symbol. And if you step outside the propaganda studio, 13's justice system is harsher than its clean grey walls suggest. Miss a scheduled block, you're reprimanded, hoard bread, punishment. Coin is ready to execute Snow without a real trial, and she proposes a symbolic final Hunger Games using Capitol children. So why does that feel so familiar? Because we've heard this promise before. Sacrifice a few for stability, and everything will be fine. Collins is doing something very specific with all this off-screen space. She's showing that once a government believes no one is watching, the rules become optional. The question stops being who's good and who's evil, and shifts to who's willing to build their new world on invisible bodies. And if the rebellion can hide bombs behind white parachutes, what else is it willing to keep off camera in the name of hope? The children of the games, generational trauma we never fully see. So when the story cuts from white parachutes to a yellow meadow, it feels peaceful on the surface. But here's the real question. What does it actually mean to raise children on ground that's still soaked in the games? At face value, that epilogue looks simple. Katniss and Peter. 2 kids. A world without arenas. You're supposed to feel relief, maybe even closure. The games are gone, the Capitol is restructured, the good side won. So why does Katniss tell us it took years before she could even agree to have a child? Why is the promise of safety still not enough for someone who technically got everything she fought for? This is where we talk about generational trauma. We never see Katniss pregnant, never see Peter pacing at night, never see the quiet arguments about whether bringing a baby into this world is an act of hope or a repeat of the reaping. Collins skips all of that. Instead, we drop into one afternoon where their children are playing in a field, and Katniss is mentally overlaying their game with her own highlight reel of death traps. Same word, very different games. You watch those kids chase butterflies, and Katniss is remembering fireballs, mutts engineered from dead tributes, and the moment a name in a bowl almost killed her sister. That part matters because it shows you the arena never really shuts off in her head. The kids are technically safe from the reaping, but they're not safe from the nightmares sleeping in their parents' nervous systems. And the book barely lingers there. We don't unpack what it means to have a father whose memories were hijacked, who once tried to strangle their mother because snow rewired his brain. We don't see Peter flinch when his son raises his voice, or Katniss freeze when her daughter's laughter sounds too close to a Capitol broadcast. But you know it's there. The torture, the prostitution Finnick endured, Johanna's water conditioning, the Avoxes serving silently in the background. Those scars don't vanish just because the cameras did. Now scale that up. It's not just 2 kids in District 12. It's thousands of children born to former victors, rebels and starving district citizens who survived public whippings, bombings and disappearances. Every household has its own off-screen dark days. A parent who was almost an Avox, a grandparent who died for stealing bread, a sibling turned into a mutation in some lab no one talks about. There is a lot to uncover here, but the text deliberately doesn't. So why end on that quiet domestic scene instead of a triumphant speech in the new Capitol Square? Because Collins is telling you the real cost of off-screen horror is paid in relationships, not statistics. The question stops being how many died and becomes, what does love look like after this? And the unsettling part is, we only ever get the opening frame of that story, the one scene you'd never want to see filmed. So if the cost of all this horror shows up in the way Katniss hugs Peter, here's the real question. Which moment behind that hug would you actually be able to watch? Thought experiment time. You're handed a massive budget and told you have to fully adapt one off-screen nightmare. The creation of the Wolf Mutts, Finnick's first client, Johanna's water torture, or Peter's hijacking sessions. No cutaways. No tasteful fade to black. Which one do you choose, and why are you already regretting it? Start with the Mutts. On screen, you'd probably open in a sterile Capitol lab, glass walls, white floors, everything humming. At face value, it's just science. But then you notice the details. Tags with tribute numbers. A technician casually scrolling through footage of the bloodbath at the cornucopia to source expressions. Tanks where half-formed creatures twitch, their eyes already familiar. That part matters because you suddenly understand the games don't end when the cannon sounds. The dead are literally recycled into weapons. Then there's Finnick. You don't need explicit content to make that unbearable. Picture an opulent Capitol bedroom, all golden velvet, the city's skyline glowing through the window. A boy barely older than you stands in the doorway in his victor's crown, while Snow's voice plays in your head, explaining what happens if he says no. The camera could stay on Finnick's face as the door closes. No graphic detail, just the moment he realizes the promise of victory was a trap, and his body is now a district resource the Capitol can rent out. Johanna's torture room would look almost boring. Concrete walls, a chair bolted to the floor, a drain you really don't want to think about. Peacekeepers with clipboards, as if this is just another maintenance task for the regime. Water pours, lights flash, and every time she flinches, you remember the confident, sarcastic Victor from the arena and watch her relationship with water reprogrammed into pure panic. And then Peter. Bright, clinical lighting. A recorded image of Katniss looped on a screen. Technicians adjust a dial and his memories warp in real time. We're going to cover hijacking more in a second, but this is where we talk about psychological horror as policy. The Capitol doesn't just break your body, it rewrites your history until the person who loved you becomes the monster in your head. Here's the twist. Would seeing any of this actually make the story better? Or is it more disturbing that Collins forces you to reverse engineer these rooms from the way survivors move, flinch, and refuse to talk? There is a lot to uncover here about why horror often works best in negative space. Because once you imagine those labs and bedrooms and interrogation chairs, every Capitol broadcast, every rose on Snow's desk, hits different. The games seep into everything. So which scene would you pick, and would you really want to see it? Or should some doors in Panem stay shut? Hold that thought, because the next off-screen horror is about the people who tried to run and never got to choose at all. Rereading the trilogy with X-ray vision. So once you've met the people who tried to run and got turned into avoxes, here's the twist. You can't really read The Hunger Games the same way again. This is where we talk about rereading the trilogy with what is basically X-ray vision. On your first pass, you're racing through the plot, wondering who survives the arena. On the second, you slow down, you start asking, why did that servant flinch? Why does that victor change the subject? Why does the narrative cut away right there? At face value, those are throwaway beats. Under X-ray, they're crime scenes. So here's a strategy. On your next read, track every mention of avoxes. Every time Katniss notices a red-haired servant, a lowered gaze, a tray that trembles. You know now these are runaways, rebels, children whose tongues were cut out. The Capitol literally removed their voices. That part matters because suddenly the background staff in every Capitol scene aren't set dressing. They're a mass grave that's still walking around. Then do the same with Victor's private obligations. Finnick's charm offensive? Johanna's rage? Every time a mentor drinks too much or refuses to answer a simple question, pause. We're going to cover some of those lines in detail. Finnick offering sugar cubes to Katniss and Haymitch on the train, for example. The first time, it plays as flirting and theatrics. But once you know he's been sold to Capitol citizens since he was 14, that tray of sugar isn't cute. It's a prop from his other job. Johanna's naked elevator stunt works the same way. On the surface, it's comic relief, a way to embarrass Katniss and poke at Capitol norms. But here's the real question. Why is a woman who was tortured, stripped, and broken by the Capitol so intent on weaponizing her own body as a joke? Once you've mapped the off-screen torture and the way victors are displayed, that scene stops being quirky and starts reading as a dare. You wanted a show? Fine. Choke on it. Pattern interrupt for your movie rewatches. The next time you see Snow in his rose garden, don't just focus on the speech. Mentally restore the book details, the blood smell under the roses, the poison, the medical procedures, the people who vanished so he could keep power. Every flowerbed becomes a cover-up. Every feast in the Capitol, every victory crown feels less like celebration and more like evidence disposal. And this is where it gets fun in the most disturbing way. Watch the films with the books running in your head as a second audio track. When the movies sanitize something, cutting the worst of the mutts, softening the victor's addictions, you can unsanitize it in real time. Suddenly, that quiet train ride or that quick party montage is haunted by everything the camera refused to show. There is a lot to uncover here, and it doesn't just make Panem darker, it makes the relationship between silence and power clearer. Collins builds a world where what isn't said is the point. Absence becomes a political tool, and if you're reading with X-ray vision, the games never really end. They just move into the negative space between sentences. So once you've trained your eyes for what's missing, what happens when the capital starts losing control of the story altogether? Ranking Panem's most disturbing off-screen atrocities. So once the capital starts losing control of the story, here's the real question. Which horrors rise to the top when you finally see the outline of the whole system? If we had to rank Panem's worst off-screen atrocities, what actually sits at number 1? To do that, we need criteria. Not just what made you flinch, but scale of harm, intimacy of the violation, how premeditated it is, and how much Collins deliberately leaves to our imagination. That part matters because the less she shows, the more you have to fill in the gaps, and the games keep bleeding into that negative space. So in 5th place, we're going to cover the avoxes. At face value, it's a punishment. You run, you rebel. The capital cuts out your tongue and turns you into a servant. But when you think about why, it's about turning a person into decor. They're always in the room, never in the conversation. The relationship between silence and power becomes physical. It's horrifying, but it's also almost casual, which is why it sits lower on this list. 4th, the tribute-based mutts. This is where we talk about weaponized grief. The capital takes DNA from tributes and prisoners, engineers mutations, and then drops them back into the arena as living weapons. It's not just killing, it's recycling human remains into content. You're not allowed to bury your dead. The capital does that for you in a lab and then sells the result as entertainment. The scale is smaller than some other abuses, but the premeditation is chilling. 3rd, Finnick's sexual slavery ring. Snow uses a victor's body as political currency, especially when they're still basically a child. The promise of safety after the games gets inverted into lifelong exploitation, and your loved ones become leverage. This is intimate in a way the arena never is. It's built on trust. Your admirers, your sponsors, your fans, and then it turns that attention into a trap. 2nd, Johanna's torture and conditioning. She's stripped, beaten, shocked with water until her body itself is a trigger. The capital isn't just hurting her, it's reprogramming her reactions so that ordinary things, baths, rain, become weapons. It's targeted, it's sustained, and most of it happens off-page, which forces you to imagine the gaps every time she flinches. And in 1st place, systematic hijacking and psychological experimentation. Rewriting someone's mind might be the ultimate violation in Panem. With Peter, we see the blueprint, tracker-jacker venom, recorded footage, repeated conditioning until his memories are booby-trapped. You don't just lose your freedom or your body, you lose the ability to trust your own thoughts. Could you rank these differently? Absolutely. Depending on your own triggers, bodily mutilation, sexual violence, psychological torture, your list might flip completely. But that's kind of the point. The worst things in Panem are precisely the ones the cameras never show and the capital never admits. And once you see that, you have to ask, who else disappeared into that off-screen machinery that we never even hear about? Why Collins keeps cutting away? narrative mercy or strategic horror. So if whole lives can vanish into that machinery, why doesn't Suzanne Collins show us every bolt and blade of it on the page? Why cut away when things get truly unbearable instead of just going there? At face value, you could say it's simple. This is shelved as YA. You're talking about a series sold to teens, taught in middle schools, handed to 12-year-olds who are still technically young enough to be reaped in universe. Of course, a publisher is going to flinch at graphic depictions of sexual violence, torture, and mutilation. That seems like the obvious reason, right? But here's the real question. If it's just about protecting younger readers, why is Collins so unflinching everywhere else? She gives you Rue's spear wound, Cato's slow death with the mutts, Peter's leg being torn up so badly it has to be amputated, public whippings in the district square, starvation so intense people consider eating the dead. She does not promise you comfort. So why does Finnick's sexual exploitation stay mostly an implication? Why do we hear that Johanna was stripped and tortured with water without sitting in the cell with her? Why is hijacking described clinically instead of framed as a long, lovingly detailed torture montage? There is a lot to uncover here because those gaps don't feel accidental. They feel surgical. This is where we talk about ethical storytelling. Collins knows the capital turns pain into spectacle. That's literally the games. The cameras linger on child soldiers killing each other, on fire dresses and kissing scenes, on victors breaking down in post-games interviews. The whole system is built on the relationship between suffering and ratings. So what happens if the book starts doing the same thing with sexual violence or long graphic torture scenes? Suddenly, the narrative is competing with Snow's show for who can make horror more interesting. Instead, she acknowledges those horrors without feeding them to you as entertainment. Finnick tells you he was sold to capital elites, that Snow used the threat to Annie as leverage. You're given the pieces: his age when he won, his beauty, his sugar cube flirting, his trauma. Collins trusts you to assemble what that really means. That part matters because it shifts the burden of imagination onto you. The book refuses to aestheticize what the capital would absolutely glamorize. And notice how that mirrors the in-universe media. The capital hides its worst acts. Avoxes with their tongues cut out work silently in the background. Mutation labs are buried underground. Hijacking happens off camera. The broadcasts cut away from what might break the illusion of hope. The text does a parallel move, but for the opposite reason. When the narrative withholds an image, it's not to protect the system, it's to make you aware you're even wanting to see it. So we're going to cover one more layer here. The off-screen space is actually where Collins trusts the reader most. She assumes you can handle the truth without needing every frame described. She hands you Snow's roses, his blood smell, his threats, the vanished rebels, the broken victors, and says, "You know what this adds up to. Do you really need the camera to stay on?" Because the next question is brutal. If she had shown you everything, would you have turned away or watched anyway? Living in a world that loves spectacle, why Panem still hits too close. So here's the uncomfortable twist. You've just been asked whether you'd keep watching if Collins showed you everything. Now ask this instead. Are we already watching? Because Panem isn't just a fantasy of cruelty, it's an exaggeration of something we already participate in every day. At face value, the games are a dystopian blood sport. But here's the real question. How different is that from binging reality TV, where people are pushed to breakdowns, or endlessly scrolling true crime about real murders, edited to feel bingeable and neat? This is where we talk about spectacle. The capital tunes into the arena. We tune into war footage, disaster clips, and shocking body cam videos that have already been trimmed for broadcast. The worst screams? The longest hospital nights. Those get cut for time or for community guidelines. The capital of Panem literally censors the game's feed so citizens don't see certain deaths. We blur faces, mute audio, crop the frame. Different technology, same relationship to someone else's pain. And it's not just the violence that's visible, it's the violence that never makes it on screen. In Panem, most of the brutality isn't in the arena at all, it's in the districts. Starvation in 12. Broken backs in the mines. Peacekeepers whipping people in the square when the cameras aren't there. We have our own version, poverty that never trends, workers collapsing in unsafe factories, protesters kettled and beaten out of frame. There is a lot to uncover here, because structural violence rarely comes with a broadcast schedule. If you're not the one living it, you can miss that it's even happening. Capital citizens don't wake up thinking, "I support child murder." They wake up thinking about fashion, bets, and which victor's interview will be the most dramatic this year. That part matters because it mirrors how easy it is for us to cheer stories of resilience without asking why resilience was required in the first place. We love the narrative of the worker who pulled themselves up, the refugee who made it, the survivor who overcame. But how often do we interrogate the systems that put them in the arena? Here's the pattern interrupt. The most disturbing thing about Panem isn't that people suffer, it's that other people can watch, enjoy, and move on. We do this with victors too. We adore Katniss's defiance, Finnick's charm, Johanna's rage. We celebrate survival and heroism, while the machinery that produced their trauma hums quietly in the background, off-screen and off-topic. The reason The Hunger Games lingers is that its off-screen horrors act as a mirror. They keep asking, what are you not seeing in your own world? Whose pain has been edited out so your feed feels manageable? Revisiting Panem with that lens doesn't mean hating every story of hope or every game show. It means paying attention to the silences, to what the camera crops out, and as we move into the next off-screen horror, keep that in mind. In Panem and in our world, the scariest things are usually the ones someone worked very hard to keep just out of frame. From the arena to the shadows, what we've really learned about Panem. So when you zoom out from those cropped frames, what do we actually see? You start to realize the arena is just the showroom. The real product is everything happening in the shadows around it. We've gone from the dark days and Snow's rise, where the capital learns the hard way that open war is messy and unstable, to a system where the same brutality gets repackaged as order, entertainment, and tradition. Back then, it was bombing districts and street executions. Now, it's peacekeeping, tesserae, and a yearly event that at face value looks controlled. The question is, controlled for whom? This is where we talk about those districts you barely see in the films. Starvation isn't an accident, it's policy. Public whippings in the square, peacekeepers rotating in so they never form a relationship with locals. That part matters because it keeps every district just desperate enough to obey, but not quite desperate enough to revolt. You don't need cameras for that. You just need hunger, fear, and a reminder that the capital is always watching. Then, we stepped behind the curtain of the lucky few who survived the games. Any victor will tell you the games don't end when you win. Addiction, prostitution, and lifelong mentoring aren't side notes. They're the off-screen sequel. Finnick's whole story, sold to capital elites, his loved ones held hostage, is the clearest example of how a supposed prize becomes a leash. Here's the real question. If victory is this horrific, what does that say about the system that keeps selling it as hope? From there, the machinery only gets colder. Avoxes, tongues cut out so they can serve in silence. Mutations built from the DNA of dead tributes and prisoners, turning human remains into weapons. Johanna stripped, beaten, and conditioned with water until even a shower is torture. Hijacking that rewrites Peter's memories so love itself becomes a landmine. Every one of these is an off-screen program designed to do the same three things: control bodies, rewrite minds, and keep that fragile balance where rebellion always feels possible, but never quite safe enough to attempt. And Collins rarely shows you the worst of it directly. There is a lot to uncover here in what she doesn't describe. The way victors flinch at certain sounds. The quiet terror when Snow's roses appear. The fact that post-war, Katniss, Annie, and the others are still shattered. Even after the cameras are gone, the world feels bigger and more unsettling precisely because so many horrors stay in the negative space, implied instead of exhibited. So as we move into prequels, spin-offs, and fan theories, we're going to cover more than just what's on the screen. The real question for any new Hunger Games story is always, what aren't we being shown here, and who benefits from that? Because in Panem, every gap in the footage is a clue, and every silence is probably hiding a scream. Your turn in the victor's village. Share the moment you can't stop thinking about. So now it's your turn in the victor's village. You've walked past the empty houses, you've heard the stories the cameras won't touch. Here's the real question. Which off-screen Hunger Games detail would you never want to see fully adapted, even though it's already haunting your brain? Is it the Arvoxes, those disappeared rebels and runaways, forced to serve in red while the capital pretends they're just decor? Is it the Mutt Labs, where someone had to decide which tribute's eyes go on which beast? Or is it Finnick's clients, the ones who paid in secrets while he paid in pieces of himself? Tell me the one moment that gets under your skin the most, and why. What's the scene where, if a director tried to show it, you'd almost rather they cut away? Because there is a lot to uncover here, and I want to know where you want us to go next. I'm putting a poll in the community tab and a pinned comment under this video. You can vote on which disturbing off-screen topic should get its own deep dive. Avoxes, and what their existence says about the relationship between silence and power. The mutation program and the ethics of turning human remains into weapons, Finnick's exploitation network and Snow's blackmail system, or the hijacking labs that turn Peter's memories into landmines. At face value, these are just background horrors. But that part matters because once you start looking at them, Snow and Coin stop being distant villains and start feeling uncomfortably real. So tell me in the comments, did learning about the sexual slavery of victors change how you read Snow's roses and that constant smell of blood? Did Johanna's off-screen torture or Peter's hijacking shift your sense of what Coin was willing to do in the name of hope and order? And what about the regular people of the capital and the districts? When you found out what an AVOX actually is, did it change how you see the prep teams fussing over Katniss? Or the way district citizens watch the games in the square? Do you feel more sympathy for Katniss and Peter as survivors? Or more anger that the system kept asking them to perform their trauma for ratings? If you want to keep pulling on those threads, this is where we talk about long-form, lore-heavy breakdowns. We're going to cover how Panem's institutions really work. Snows rise during the dark days, the peacekeeper machine, the economics of starvation. So if that's your thing, make sure you're around for it. Check out the Finnick analysis in the description, or the Snow character study that goes deep into why he thinks terror is a reasonable form of love. Because in Panem, the scariest things are never on camera. And in our world, the real horror might be whatever's sitting just outside the frame of our own screens. So the next time you rewatch the games and the feed cuts away, ask yourself, what are we not being shown today? And who's making that choice for us?